Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with John Wick, the creative director for 7th Sea, and we talked about violence in tabletop role-playing games. Violence and combat more specifically is an important part of a lot of games. I asked John, as a writer on different games with varied levels of violence in them, like 7th Sea and Legend of the Five Rings, to share his perspective on how violence fits into tabletop role-playing games more broadly. I'm going to jump across with that interview in just a moment, but first, remember to subscribe to the Chaosium YouTube channel. It helps us out and it lets us make more content like this. Thanks.
Well, in general, it's how the games use violence as the way to resolve problems. And this stems from role-playing games' origins as tabletop strategy games, right? And so that kind of holdover from playing Stratego and the World War II tank games and and all that kind of stuff. It carried over into Dungeons and Dragons, which is going through dungeons and killing monsters and taking their stuff. And so role-playing games, if you look through them, they'll have, like, I like to say that role-playing games, and some of them in particular, were clearly written by virgins with sword fetishes, because there's 500 pages on how to do a 5-second combat, but seducing the barmaid or the bard fellow or the bar fellow is like 1d20 roll. So clearly people don't understand what's really going on. And also, a game tells you through its mechanics how it expects you to behave. So if a role-playing game has a whole bunch of rules about violence and one role for persuasion, seduction, convincing people, intimidating people, or anything like that, then clearly the game is geared toward violence, as using violence as a tool for resolving problems.
So that's kind of a look at the broad spectrum. And I want to dive in more particularly now into your work specifically and your personal experience. So I'm most interested to hear how 7th Sea approaches violence. But if you can think of any other examples of your work from other TTRPG systems that have maybe a radically different take on violence, I'd love to hear about that too.
Well, the first real role-playing game I designed, which was designed with me as the lead and other people assisting, a team, was the Legend of the Five Rings role-playing game. And in that one, if you get hit by a katana, you're pretty much dead. That's it. One strike. That's it. Because that was what we were trying to emulate. We were trying to emulate the Chanabra films of Akira Kurosawa and things like that, the Lone Wolf and Cub movies and things. So in that sense, violence is a means to solve problems, but it's a deadly means to solving problems. One strike. If you don't strike first, you don't strike at all. Right? That was the whole thing. And it really changed how players played the game, because they knew that violence was going to be a last resort, or a threat, right? A lot of times the game, you could, I'm a Crane Clan samurai and I'm got my Dojimon on my thing, and people go, "Oh, that guy knows how to use a sword." So, you can use it as an intimidation factor or things like that. And then 7th Sea isn't so much a violence game as it is an action game. Yes, it has action scenes, but the violence in it is often, we call it a PG-13 game, or like in The Princess Bride. In The Princess Bride, you don't see any blood. In Pirates of the Caribbean, you don't see any blood. There's violence, right? But you don't see any blood. And it is an accurate interpretation to say some characters are knocked out or made incapacitated rather than killed. In some cases, that's not the case. But so 7th Sea, there is only one way for characters to die in 7th Sea. Otherwise, they become helpless. They're incapacitated. They can't do anything. And the only way for characters to die in 7th Sea is if a capital V villain kills them. So you can't get killed by the kobold with a rusty dagger. That's not going to happen. A villain, capital V, has to kill you. And that creates the kind of action scene that we want, where it's a whole bunch of hey ho, Captain Blood, swashbuckling Three Musketeers, all that kind of very light-hearted violence. But when a villain comes onto the stage, everything changes. And that's kind of how the tone of violence in 7th Sea works.
So every different table and every different person at a table is going to have a different ideal level of violence. And there's no right level, obviously, because even amongst individuals, the right level is going to change depending on the day and their mood and everything like that. But I'd like to ask you, in terms of the different levels of violence for a game like, Legend of the Five Rings, which I realize I have the book behind me, which is what made me think of, oh, don't just ask about 7th Sea. And in 7th Sea, in these different versions, low and high violence, what do those levels of violence allow the games to focus more on? What kind of stories do they enable us to tell? What kind of sessions do they allow us to bring forward to the forefront?
Well, the game it's what I call the Mr. Miyagi rule from the Karate Kid. Mr. Miyagi says there's no such thing as a bad student, just bad teachers. The teacher says do this and the student does it. Well, it's the same thing with role-playing games. If a role-playing game has mechanics that are focused on violence, then the players are going to play it that way. If they don't, they're kind of, it's not wrong to not play it that way, but you're kind of not playing the game the way the designer intended. And you know what? That's fine too. There's a whole ton of people who modify 7th Sea rules, modify L5R rules, modify any, rules at all. And that's fine because they're tailoring it to themselves. They're tailoring it to their group, what level of comfort they have with violence in their game. So, but I think that most importantly, you can get a sense of what level of comfort the author has with violence by reading the rules. For example, there are some games where your character just can't die. Like there is no stat for violence in the game. Why would there be? If I was going to design the West Wing role-playing game, there's no violence in that. There's like armor class, what kind of armor class does the president have? If you're making a Jane Austen role-playing game, you shouldn't be asking how many hit points does the bride have? Those things don't come up in that literature. And if they did, if I saw a role-playing game for the West Wing or for Jane Austen or for something like that, and I saw that armor class, hit points, damage bonuses and all that were in it, first thing is, I don't think this person understands the literature. And two, it is really communicating to me how that person feels about violence in role-playing games, especially since they're trying to insert it into a game that really doesn't need it.
While we're talking about the shape of games in general, I want to ask more specifically about 7th Sea one last time. And that's because I think that there's a couple of interesting, not necessarily contradictions, but opposites or some kind of dynamic going on.
Dichotomies.
Yeah, dichotomies. There we go. You've got the better word for it.
I are a writer.
Exactly. So 7th Sea is a historical game. It's not set in the real world. It's set in Thea, even though there are obviously several analogies. But despite being a very historically focused game, the violence that is reflected in 7th Sea is nothing like the historical violence that was present in the golden age of piracy. Can you talk a little bit about that dichotomy?
Yeah, there are things that I use, but yeah, firearms in the game do not, because a firearm is a weapon, is a tool that's designed to kill people, and that makes it a weapon, right? But firearms do not have the same kind of effect they do in our game that they do in real life. And that's a deliberate choice. Because in the heroic literature, while firearms are incredibly dangerous, they're used more as threats, and they're used more as an escalation of consequences. You're raising the stakes in a scene. If somebody pulls a pistol, that raises the stakes in the scene. And so that's what they are more in 7th. And the reason for that was because we didn't want a game where people were just running around shooting each other. We want them using swords. We want them using, their fists. We want them swinging on chandeliers and kicking the villain in the face while they drink a beer and kiss the prince or princess of their choice as they fly out the window. That's the game we want. And so one of the things I've been doing actually as a house rule is I have a new rule for pistols and muskets and firearms in general, which is when you shoot somebody with a pistol, they become helpless. No wounds, they become helpless unless they spend a hero point, which means that they dodge the bullet. And that makes firearms incredibly dangerous. But the other part of it is if a hero pulls a pistol and shoots somebody, they get a corruption point, which is a dangerous mechanic in 7th because it can lead you to becoming a villain. The only time that drawing a pistol or firing a musket and that a hero can do it without getting a corruption point is if the villain did it first. So the villain has escalated things. And you can think of the scene where the villain pulls a pistol and the hero pulls a pistol afterwards. You seldom in swashbuckling literature see heroes escalating the stakes. It's always the villains who are escalating the stakes, unless you get the Inigo Montoya effect, which is something else entirely.
I love that home rule. I think it's great. I want to steer the conversation now towards GMs, towards narrators and storytellers, and try and pass some of this larger topic into advice for them. What can you suggest to people who are running games about how they should manage violence, how they should balance the levels? What's just some general tips you have?
Well, that depends on the kind of game you're playing. Some games are just designed for violence. They're designed to solve problems with violence. If that's the case, I recommend making the violence personal. Too often it's just it's orcs. The orcs don't have a name. None of the orcs have names. None of the orcs have personalities. None of the orcs have anything else. For me, running across a small group of orcs and it's one male and two women with babies. Now what do? Oh, we're just going to murder the orc. Okay, great. You're chaotic evil. Have a nice day. I always recommend making violence personal. And the reason is because I'm a professional wrestling fan, which is how, if you watch good professional wrestling, I'm not being paid, but AEW on TBS every Wednesday night, professional wrestling will teach you how to tell stories within a fight. My friend Michael Kahn likes to say that professional wrestling is the story of a wrestling match that turns into a fight. And it's when the bad guy, the heel, throws a punch. That's when it turns into a fight. And then, so many, because professional wrestling is the medium of telling stories with a fight or telling the story of a fight. And so that's what I would encourage people to do. If you're going to have a fight scene in your fight-oriented role-playing game, set up consequences, not just do we beat the orcs or do we beat the trolls, but set up another consequence that will happen if the players don't deal with it. I like using the example of there being a room that's on fire and you're trying to deal with the villain, but the villain has musketeers in the balconies firing down at you. There's a blackmail letter that you need to get a hold of that's dangerously close to the fire. And in the corner, there's a family of servants who are going to be eaten by the fire if you don't do something. So now it's not just a straight up fight with the villain. It's dealing with the musketeers. It's dealing with the letter. It's dealing with the family. It's, there's all these things going on. And that way you make the fight, the action scene less about being a punching contest, and more about choices that the players have to make. And oftentimes they don't have enough resources to deal with all the choices, and they have to figure out how to deal with that.
So to summarize, it sounds like what you're saying is you want to find based on the system that you're playing, the setting, and of course the table. Find the right level of violence, and if it's a high level, make it count, make it impactful, and focus on that as a point. And if it's not necessarily so important, look at ways that you can twist things to add more exciting details and focus, like you said before, on action rather than violence.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of saying it. Focus on, we call them in 7C, we call them action scenes, because there's more going on than just, I roll to hit you, you roll to hit me, I roll to hit you, you roll. I mean, to me, that's boring. I'm not interested in waiting for my turn to roll a d20 to see if my plan worked, if I get to throw the holy water at the vampire or not. I want to be doing things in a scene that have more to do than just trying to cause hit points.
I think you've given me a lot to think about and given everyone watching a lot to think about. Is there anything that I didn't ask which you'd like to add? Any final points on the topic of violence in tabletop role-playing games?
Combat in most role-playing games takes 3 hours to resolve 10 minutes. And I would rather be role-playing. I would rather be interacting with characters. I'd rather be talking to, if we're going to play Cyberpunk, for example, I would rather be contacting, making contact with my contacts on the streets to try to sabotage the megacorp, to, blah, blah, all those kinds of things. And if we're going to have a scene with violence, let's resolve it in 2 seconds. I roll my fight, you roll yours, done. Why does it require initiative, rounds, turns, hit points, armor class? I roll to hit you, I have to beat your armor class, you get to dodge, blah, blah, blah. What is that? What is that? Why don't we just, I fight, you fight, I win, we describe the scene, we move on? I mean, unless that's what you want the game to be, which is super nitpicky detail, like we're going to count every point of blood. Going to count every point of blood. There is a game called Phoenix Command from the 80s where you can do damage to your spleen. Your spleen, right? And that's like the end point. That's like the furthest. That's the furthest, right? But to me, it's like Raymond Chandler is famous for saying in his pulp noir novels that whenever he didn't know what was going to happen next, he had a guy with a gun walk in the room. And very, very seldom in Chandler's novels does the gun ever get fired, because everybody in the room knows that a gun pointed at you doesn't tickle. It is a tool designed to kill you, not to wound you, not to, to kill you. So that the threat of violence, if this is important to you, and it may be not, but if the threat of violence is more potent, then roll for initiative, roll for this, roll for that. Like in L5R, one sword strike kills you. That changes how people play the game. And if that's something you want to see in your game, then you should try that. If that's not something you want to see in your game, hey, then you can design your game. It's your game. You could design it any way you want. So, but from my point of view, I'm more interested in games where the violence has consequences and where violence raises stakes rather than it's a math problem.